Okay, you're listening to the award-winning Philadelphia Hall Monitor here on WPPM 16.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHM WPPM. Tonight on the show, we'll be joined by Marco Serino of the Philadelphia Tribune to discuss yesterday's election results and our big post-election show, following our big election show from last night. And as always, Denise Clay Murray is here. Denise, how are you tonight?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Have you recovered from last night?
Well, no, because I still haven't gotten any more sleep.
Yep, I understand that. And
And
Lance Haver is here,
yay,
or he was.
yay. Hi,
There he
Lance.
is. Lance, how are you tonight?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm doing fine. And I'd like to bring in our guest for the evening, Marco Serino of the Tribune. Marco, how are you tonight?
Hi everyone. Thanks for having me on again. Great to see y'all as usual.
Well, thank you for being here. So let's get right into it. Big night last night. Historic night in many ways. But before we get to the mayor's race and all that, I'd like to start with what I think is the topic of the day, the Working Families Party here in Philadelphia. Last night, they took the 2 minority council seats, and there will not be a Republican in those seats now, which I think for a lot of people was a big surprise. At about 10:30 last night, it looked like Nicholas O'Rourke was on the outside looking in, and then we saw some wards and precincts come in that put him over the top. So Denise, let me start with you. What do you make of the Working Families Party historic victory last night?
Well, if I'm a third party person, or I want to start a third party, or in this case in Philadelphia, a fourth party, I would find out what they did right. I would find out what the secret sauce is, because when Kendra Brooks became the first person to win a seat on city council as a third party candidate in 70 years, 4 years ago, Nicholas O'Rourke wasn't too far away from joining her. The only thing that kind of stood in between all that was the fact that David O, who lost last night in his bid to become the city's mayor, was somewhat popular, and he was able to get the votes to stay in his seat. But the Republicans, I have never seen any group of people do something so incompetently in my life. And I have been covering politics for a lot of years. There's nothing that you can assume in politics. And one of the things that, makes it so you can't assume things is the fact that money is, the mother's milk of politics. The Working Families Party outraised the Republicans in terms of money for the race. They outraised them, they out door knocked them, they out, publicized themselves when it came to the Republicans. The only reason that one of the Republicans had television ads was because he was endorsed by the laborers. And it was just not a good thing for a party with national origins to get, completely squeezed out. And now what's going to be interesting is seeing how Brian O'Neill, who was the lone Republican in the city to win anything last night, negotiates this new normal as he goes into his 12th term as a city councilman.
That's right. Councilmember Brian O'Neill will be the only Republican on city council, and I don't even know if that he is technically in the minority, but he is the minority in the minority. Mm-hmm. Lance, what do you take away from this Working Families Party win?
Well, the first thing is to recognize that Jeffrey Yaz is the biggest loser in this election. Not only did he put money into trying to defeat the Working Families parties, he put money into trying to get the Moms of Liberty to win elections in the school boards across the state. And for all the money he spent, he has nothing to show for it other than the checks that were cashed. And I think that's something that we should take note of, because one of the things that happens in Philadelphia when we talk about an elected school board, we're the only county in the state that doesn't have an elected school board, is we're told, well, the money will change the makeup of the board. And here we see Jeffrey Yaz pouring literally hundreds of thousands, in some case millions of dollars, and not being able to win a single race. I do wonder who he's using as his professional staff. The second thing I believe is that the Working Families Party is not really a third party. They're really a wing of the Democratic Party. And I say that because when you pick up their literature, they endorsed the mayor-to-be, Ms. Parker. They endorse Democrats on a regular basis. And what they really are is a part of the Democratic Party that's running against the Republicans. So I do think that makes it easier for them to win those seats, because they're not challenging any Democrats. And in fact, their literature is very clear on that. It very clearly says, vote for the Democrats, but only 3 of the 5 then vote for us. And finally, I went and looked at some of the ward votes and some of the division votes for the Working Families, and it tracks very closely to the successes of former Councilwoman Helen Gim. And I think what it shows is there is a percentage of us in Philadelphia who support a progressive politics, but that is a limited number. So if you looked at the votes that Ms. Gim got in the mayoral primary, and you look at the votes that the Working Families got in this general election, they're very close to the same votes, and they're very close to coming from the same areas. So for example, in the 22nd Ward, which is in Mount Airy, a very liberal ward, 2nd Division, Ms. Gim did incredibly well, and so did Mr. O'Rourke and Ms. Brooks. In the 61st Ward, which is not a progressive ward, that's East Oak Lane. That's a ward where you would expect it not to be overwhelmingly progressive, and that's what the vote was. Ms. Gim got 14 votes, Mr. O'Rourke 25, and Ms. Brooks 28. Same thing's true in the 52nd Ward, which is again in West Philadelphia. This is not a ward, a Center City ward or University of Pennsylvania ward, not a ward that's associated with progressive movements. And again, Ms. Gim did not do particularly well, 32 votes. Mr. O'Rourke got 33 votes, and Ms. Brooks got 47 votes. So I think we see that there is this entrenchment of the traditional Democrats, and inside of that are the progressive Democrats in the 2nd Ward, in the wards around the University of Philadelphia, the University of Pennsylvania. And those people who identified as progressive turned out in numbers sufficient enough to defeat the Republicans.
And Lance, it's interesting when you discuss the Working Families Party as a wing of the Democratic Party. I think, that's a popular view, except within the Democratic Party, particularly the leadership, where it's funny to me that they don't want to really be associated with the Working Families Party, yet the Working Families Party is having tremendous success. To me, that's just an odd situation. Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Well, let's wait until we start looking at the voter turnout for the state race, because I think that's where we'll see some of that interest.
Okay. Now, Marco Serino of the Philadelphia Tribune, you're a City Hall observer. 4 years ago, we saw what some people, I think, would say is Kendra Brooks' upset win to get on City Council. Now we see her bringing another Working Families Party candidate with her. What do you make of this, and what do you attribute to their success?
I hadn't had the chance to follow the council at large races as closely, but Lance brought up a very good point. One thing I saw last night on social media that stood out that they mentioned for the state races was high turnout at the universities. So that probably made a difference, getting Temple and Penn and Drexel students to come out and vote in the city races. I also think they did that the Working Families Party poured a lot of money into the race. First, they poured a lot of money into Helen Gim's campaign. I was all but convinced that she would have then come out, having lost in May, and said, I'm running as a third party candidate atop the Working Family Party's ticket. She couldn't do that because of the rules. I think that now, as Denise mentioned, there's this sort of chameleon status, I think, because Brooks and O'Rourke both got big top of the ticket support from John Fetterman and from Josh Shapiro. So now the question is really, who are they? What are they? Are they going to be people who vote against things? Kendra Brooks voted against the supervised injection site ban, and she voted against the override. Where is Nicholas O'Rourke going to go on things? I don't know if it's smart for Bob Brady to literally give the Working Families Party infrastructure by expelling ward leaders and committee people and all these people with the street level expertise he has in the party, because they have supported them. And there are ward leaders who have come out and supported them. And there have been discussions of this. Now comes the interesting part. Does Bob Brady pull the trigger? Or if he does that, is this now to make the only analogy in my mind that makes any semblance of sense on this is 90s wrestling, when the New World Order in WCW split and there were two factions. So now the question is the Working Families Party a spinoff of the National Democrat of the Democratic Party in the city, or is it an entity that's going to try to change things and push things to the left with a moderate, traditionalist mayor and a moderately conservative or a moderate governor in Shapiro?
Okay, you'll have to explain that analogy to me later.
This is something where you're going to have to come into the office and talk to Eddie and I about. This is or you can just YouTube and NWO Hollywood versus NWO Wolfpack. It's a pretty wild, it's weird and wild stuff. So
okay, so Working Families Party, they win the 2 seats. They do very well in the election. Somebody else did very well in the election. Another historic win, Cheryl Parker for mayor. First African-American woman, first woman in general to hold the office. She gets 74% of the vote, just about. David O gets just over 25%. Denise, let me come to you first. Are you surprised by that margin? And what was it that made that margin so significant?
I am a little surprised by that margin, and the reason why is that David O has traditionally done very well citywide, among everybody. And I guess this time, the Democrats that wanted to come home came home and decided that they weren't going to vote for him despite having voted for him in the past. Um, you know, like I said, I thought he was going to do a little better, but I kind of knew he wasn't going to win because, let's face it, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a Republican to beat a Democrat in a citywide office, at any point in time in the general election. And it's going to be interesting to see what he does now that he's no longer a city council person and now that he's no longer the mayor. I reached out to him today because I was doing my final write-ups for the election, and he didn't get back to me. And that's weird because usually David O, will text you right back, to talk, but he hasn't gotten back to me yet. So I was kind of surprised by that. That said, I was at Sherelle Parker's election night party, and it was, I guess you could call it a cross section of people, but it was a lot of folks that you would have totally expected to see in that room. I'm surprised Bob Brady wasn't there, but Jim Kenney was. And he was standing off to the side on stage, and I took a picture of him, saying portrait of a man who's counting the days, because he kind of is. And another thing that was interesting about, being there last night is the fact that she brought up Kenyatta Johnson, councilman for the second district, um, to the stage. Now the presumption is that he's going to be the next city council president. Although if you say that to Curtis Jones, he may have you shot. But he she brought him up and kind of pledged to work together. And I was like, okay, probably right now Curtis Jones's head is exploding, one. And two, I don't know if that is necessarily going to be um the passing of the crown to him, because the last time that a mayor or someone else tried to interfere in a city council president's race was when Darrell Clark ran for the office the first time, and he will tell you that there were the powers that be actually wanted Marion Tasco to be council president, but that's not what happened. So, I hope that this doesn't backfire on the effort to make Councilman Johnson the new council president.
Lance, I'm going to ask you the exact same question I asked you last night. You have worked both in a mayoral administration and in city council. How important is it for the council president and the mayor to have a good relationship? And if what we saw last night may be the first step in that.
Well, before we talk about that, I'm going to ask Allison to call up the ward map so we can see which wards former Councilman O won, because I think when we talk about this Supreme Court race, it will be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, Allison, if you could call that up for us. I'm sorry, it's the next one, the last one I just sent. We'll see that the former Councilman O won some wards.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not a complete, even though the vote was incredibly lopsided, we're still a city that has significant divisions. And we have the very far northeast and actually farther down into what sometimes gets called the river wards where former Councilman O was successful. And I think we're going to have a look at it here. Okay, I'm sorry we're not able to call it up, but it just is a curiosity of how the Councilman O was able to win those wards. But when we look at the judicial races, we're going to see that not a single ward in the city was won by the Republican. And the difference in the Democratic and Republican candidates for the Supreme Court seat was almost exactly the difference between what the Democrat won in Philadelphia compared to what the Republican won. So I think there we're going to see that the working family discussion and the Democratic City Committee really did a tremendous job in making sure that the people who did vote were voting overwhelmingly for the Democratic candidate for judge, for the Supreme Court judge, but did not do a great job of turning out the votes. So Allegheny County, which is slightly smaller than Philadelphia. Now, Allegheny County is where Pittsburgh is, but it's more than just Pittsburgh. More people voted there than voted in Philadelphia, even though the population of Allegheny County is slightly smaller, 5% smaller than the city of Philadelphia. But to go directly to your question, I think we have seen it both ways. We have seen where a council president does not get along with the mayor, and the council president typically wins that. The council president is typically able to keep the votes together, to set the agenda, and to ensure that the mayor's agenda doesn't even get a hearing. So I think it's incredibly important, and I'll just give a couple examples. When Mayor Rendell won, he was not a John Street supporter. What happened was he had supported someone running against former Mayor Street when former Mayor Street was running for council, and it was actually a fairly close election. Then Councilman Street won, and Mayor Rendell made his peace with John Street, Council President Street, and the two of them together were able to work to really turn the finances of the city of Philadelphia around. 4 years later, they were tremendous partners. And 4 years after that, then Mayor Rendell was one of the chief people to support Council President Street in his fight to become the next mayor. And you compare that to what happened with Mayor Nutter and Council President Clark. Mayor Nutter was trying to pass agendas that the council president didn't want to have any part of. And as we spoke about last night, one of the major ways to see how that fight happened was looking at the sale of the gasworks. So Mayor Nutter wanted to privatize the gasworks. He wanted to sell it for millions of dollars and put that money into the city budget and then have ratepayers pay higher rates. So take the tax burden off of taxpayers and transfer it to people who were paying gas bills. The council president then, Council President Clark, was so opposed to it and was in a position because the then Mayor Nutter had not worked with the council president in even announcing this. The council president was able to win that fight by not having anyone even introduce a bill that would talk about the sale of the gasworks. So there are two different examples. When the mayor works with the city council president, the agenda is easier, gets done, people are able to move the city forward, versus when you have a mayor who's in opposition to the council president, and because the council president controls the budget and controls some of the activities of the city, if they're opposed, the council president will be there for 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, 16 years, and the mayor is only there for 8 years. So the council president really has a tremendous advantage in longevity and being able to make sure that the other council people are reelected and therefore may be able to stop the mayor's agenda from going forward.
Mm-hmm. Marco, does Mayor-elect Parker bringing Councilmember Johnson on stage more or less mean that that's an endorsement and that race is now, for all intents and purposes, over? Or is there still ways to go in that?
I'm not sure, but based on the fact, Ryan Boyer was on stage with her, and she's not completely committed to supporting the 76ers, this 76 plan. So read it as you want. I just think that it's I don't know, honestly. It's probably some passive endorsement, maybe, but I don't know if how much capital she's going to spend on that. She and Keanu Johnson have a similar background. They both were in Harrisburg before they went on to the councilman district seats. Does she probably want someone who can think along the lines that she does? Does she want someone who's going to be able to navigate Harrisburg and those relationships along with her, as a partner with that? I think that would make sense. Does she want to have a council president that's got the baggage she does? That's another question. That's another question to ask. She's going to be announcing her transition team tomorrow. You folks will probably be in council. I'll be 2 floors down with a bunch of other folks in the mayor's reception room, and that's probably one of the questions that will be asked. So,
well, there's not a council meeting tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. That's right. Yeah, they don't run it the week of the election, I guess. So.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's get to turnout. As of right now, the official turnout, let me just refresh to make sure I have the most accurate number, is 30.14%. 311,489 ballots cast.
Out of over 1 million voters in the city.
Yes. So, and to Lance's point, Allegheny County is not just Pittsburgh. It's an entire county with other municipalities in it. The number of people who live in Allegheny County is about 1.3 million. The number of people who live in Philadelphia city and county, it's the same. It's about 1.6 million. So they have about 300,000 people less, roughly, than Philadelphia does. The last time I checked, which was just a little while ago, not only had a higher turnout, but just a larger number of people to come out and vote. And they're a little smaller than us. Denise, what do you make of the Philadelphia turnout? Is it a disappointment? Or, as I've seen and heard from Democratic Party officials, that it's pretty good that they got to this point?
Okay, first of all, you're saying 31% turnout and pretty good in the same sentence. And
I didn't say
there's
that.
Nothing right about that.
Other people have said that. So I just want to make that clear.
Okay. Now, the Allegheny County area also had other major municipal elections going on. They had like a county commissioner's race and some other things going on that may have contributed to turnout. That said, Dan McCaffrey owes these people his seat because Philadelphia did not come out at the level that usually how the 5-county Pennsylvania, the 5-county Philadelphia area goes, so goes the state. That's not what happened in this case. Dan McCaffrey, Tamika Ward, Matt Wolf, all of the folks from the Philadelphia area that actually became judges yesterday have their brothers and sisters in Allegheny County to thank for that, because they came out a lot more than we did. And the thing is, for this election, that's not all that big a deal. I mean, it got the job done, which was to put more Democratic judges in statewide, judgeships. You have a 5-2 Pennsylvania Supreme Court now, that's weighted toward Democrats. You have more Democrats on the Superior Court. You have more Democrats on the Commonwealth Court. So it did the job. The turnout yesterday did the job. But what everybody needs to consider here is that 2024 is 2 months away. And there's some things that need to happen with turnout, particularly in Philadelphia in 2024, for the desired effect to, come up again. So I don't know what they do about that. I talked to Sharif Street, the head of the statewide Democratic Party, about that, and he doesn't seem to be too terribly worried. But he's also been the subject of criticism from within the party that, and I'm quoting someone, he doesn't know what he's doing. So it's going to be interesting to see what they take from this in terms of at least getting Philadelphia's turnout up, because Philadelphia's turnout is going to really need to come up for Bob Casey's seat to be safe, for Joe Biden to get reelected. Philadelphia is really going to need to step up. And if 31% is what people consider stepping up, then, that's not going to be good enough. And also, it might be time for the Democratic City Committee to start looking at life beyond Bob Brady. I mean, no disrespect to the chair of the city committee, but if 31% is the best you can do, and you had a mayor's race and several judicial races in here, and you spent most of your time arguing with people about whether or not, arguing with your ward leaders about whether or not the Working Families Party is actually a third party and whether they should support them or not. If that is the most that you've done in this contest, then maybe it might be time for you to find someone younger with a little more energy that to take over for you. But the unfortunate thing is the Democratic City Committee doesn't really have a bench in that regard. If they're not careful, they're going to end up in the same position the Republicans are, because no one is thinking ahead.
Lance, what do you think about turnout?
Well, I first am kind of curious whether Sharif Street is going to get credit. The Democrats, by all measures, had a tremendous day yesterday. They won not just the Supreme Court, but they won Commonwealth Court. They won the county commissioners races. They won school boards. They won everything in Philadelphia that they could possibly win, with the exception of the Brian O'Neill council seat. This is Senator Street's first election as the state chair. I don't know, whatever people are accusing him of or thinking of him, I don't know what he could do to prove his expertise more than what he has done, which is victory after victory after victory. So I think that that's something that we'll see in the future. In terms of the city of Philadelphia's turnout, I think Denise is right. Every organization should have a succession plan. I don't know that the Democratic City Committee has a succession plan. Whether Congressman Brady is ready to go to Wildwood full time or not is up to him. But time catches up with all of us. He cannot do it forever. And I think Denise is right. Having a succession plan, or a bench, as people like to call it, is the right thing to do. Another interesting aspect is, even though the turnout in Philadelphia wasn't as high as the turnout in Allegheny County, the percentage of votes that went to the Democratic candidate for Pennsylvania Supreme Court in Philadelphia County was higher than it was in Allegheny County. So the turnout, I think the only term that we could use, to be honest, was disappointing. But the people who did turn out to vote, I think the Democratic Party and the Working Families Party would have to say they felt very good about. And I think as we go forward, we're going to have a chance to see whether, like the second ward, which had a ward chairman who was openly supporting the Working Families candidate, whether the turnout there was any better than the turnout in the traditional Democratic wards. I did have a chance to look at that. So I looked again at some of the areas which would be considered more progressive wards. So the second ward, 5th Division, they had a total of 225 votes. The 21st Ward, 5th Division, had a total of 446 wards. That's a progressive ward, but not controlled by a ward leader who was openly supporting the Working Families. And the 50th Ward, which is in the backyard of Mayor-elect Parker, there they had 50th Ward, 2nd Division, they had 324 votes. Now, all of these are votes for the Democratic candidate for Pennsylvania Supreme Court, but it doesn't seem, and we're going to have a look going forward, it doesn't seem that the Working Family candidates drew out more voters than the traditional wards. And so I think, and I hope, that as we go forward as a city, we will have a fuller discussion about why people aren't voting, about what the problem is there, why people don't feel a connection to democracy, a connection to election day, and what is it about our politics that leads 7 out of 10 people to say it's not worth voting.
Right. Marco, your thoughts on turnout?
So this is interesting, that number you mentioned. I had a talk with someone who I referenced in my coverage, who didn't think that turnout was going to break 30%, and it did, which is a higher mark than we've had in the last 2 municipal elections. Now, we're used to seeing 50+% when it comes to the national elections. So, the question of who turns out. Regarding Lance's question of why people don't feel compelled to vote, because they don't think it matters. They know Philadelphia is still a one-party city. They don't see, I was surprised that, let me try to parse this. Part of it, I think, was that Sherelle had a very compelling story, but didn't have the opportunity to tell it during the general race. She had done so much work in the primary. She had done so much stuff. She'd spent so much money. There wasn't as much, opportunity to go out and meet with people and take those opportunities while she was, in the summer months and then into the fall. Her story should resonate with people, as a single mom, someone who grew up on welfare. I'm sure she's going to be, a shining jewel for the National Democratic Party going forward. She's a compelling speaker. She's She built impressive coalitions in other communities, the Northeast Philadelphia, Hispanic communities as well. People just don't think it does anything. They don't think it matters. And that's not just democracy. That's the failure of the government to be able to help people, or to at least give them an opportunity to say, hey, if you engage on this, we can, you'll see something for your investment of time and emotional capital. But in terms of turn, I was trying to follow on 66 wards, and they showed that there was, higher turnout than previous years in the center city areas. And I was like, oh, that's probably beneficial. I wasn't sure if that was beneficial to Republicans or if that was beneficial to the Working Families Party. So,
well, and it's one of these things that we did a story, or a couple of stories actually, in the primary about turnout in impoverished areas. And it's a vicious cycle, right? If you feel like you've been left behind, you may not go out and vote. And if you're a politician, you're not going into communities that don't go out to vote. You're not trying to rebuild the wheel there. And then when you're elected, you're not necessarily going to be as receptive to taking calls from those communities because they did not vote, and they probably won't vote for you in the future. And you end up in this sort of vicious cycle of almost disenfranchisement in a way. You don't think you're getting anything, so you're not going to do it. And that's one of the things. And we talk about poverty, I think, every episode of this show from the beginning. We've discussed poverty in one way or another. And that's the number one thing that I would think a Parker administration and this new city council has to focus on. So we talked about this a little bit, Denise. Is this the death knell for the Philadelphia Republican Party?
Wow, that's a hard question, and I'll tell you why. Because Philadelphia is still part of Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's still part of Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania is a swing state, while the local Republican Party is floundering, the National Republican Party will be here come 2024 to give us its special brand of positivity. Now, in terms of the city Republican Party, they need to do some soul searching. I mean, I think it was Drew Murray that said, this is the death knell for us. And the thing is, that could be the case if you don't do anything to correct it. Roughly 10 years ago, I was a part of a panel on the future of the Republican Party in Philadelphia, out in West Philly. And when asked, what the Republicans here in the city could do to specifically get Black people to consider them as an alternative, I said, you need to get your national nuts in check. And they have not done this at all. And as much as they would like to think that they should be judged completely on what they do, when you don't do a whole lot, you kind of have to look at what's in front of you. And what's in front of you is a former president with 91 indictment counts on him, a House of Representatives that is almost completely staffed by people that shouldn't be running a dog park, much less our government. You have people who are more concerned about whether or not a woman is having an abortion than what happens with the kid that you're forcing her to have, in terms of its education, in terms of being able to, have a roof over its head, in terms of its parents being able to work at a job that pays them more than $7.75 an hour. If the city's Republicans are serious about making themselves a contender, they need to see what's happening with their national party and do the exact opposite. They need to be organized. They need to find people to run for them that are not crazy. They need to tap into the base of Black Republicans that they do have and utilize them more. They need to do same with the Latino and Asian Republicans, because let's face it, Philadelphia is a majority minority city. And if you're not if you're so focused on your base in the far northeast, the people in West Philly and North Philly and South Philly that could vote for you are not even going to consider you. So they have a lot of soul searching to do, and it's going to be interesting to see what form that takes. And I'm really interested to see if Vince Fennerty, the chair of the city Republican Party, remains in that position, because it's obvious that if the only seat that you can retain is a seat that's been that's been in the hands of a guy who's had it since I was in ninth grade, you have a problem.
Well, and yes, and what I would say too, I think there's a stark divide between a national Republican and a Philadelphia Republican. We didn't have any of these Philadelphia Republican candidates talking about their pornography accountability partner, like the Speaker of the House has been doing. So speaking of which, Lance, what is a Philadelphia Republican?
I don't have a good answer for that. But again, I think Denise is right. It becomes a curiosity why the Republican Party doesn't give Mr. Finnerty staff, why
Yeah.
the state Republican Party will not give him the professional staff that they so desperately need. One of the things that I think surprised a lot of Philadelphians was that in the last presidential election, more Latino voters, more African American voters voted for Trump than they did 4 years previously. And I think a lot of us have a very difficult time understanding what the attraction is to former President Trump. But that attraction does exist. And why the Republican Party will not use professional staff to build on it, to try and figure out what they have to do. In some ways, the local Philadelphia Party, as you were saying, Larry, isn't like the national party. But perhaps the truth is that the local Republicans want the local party to be like the national party. Maybe they would prefer candidates who are espousing conspiracy theories, who go into court and berate the judge, who don't seem to have any concern about normal behaviors. So I think there's a real dilemma. Former President Trump attracts candidates that like the strongman candidate, that feel comfortable with some level of fascistic government. And the local Republicans are all saying, well, that's not us. We're not those people. But the base may want those people. They may have wanted somebody who was going to run for office in Philadelphia and say, what we really need to do is to build 4 more jails, or build a wall between Camden and Philadelphia, or stop people from moving into the city. Those may be what attracts Republican voters. And if you have moderate candidates, the base isn't going to turn out for them.
Mm-hmm. And maybe that's part of the problem. You know, like you said, the state Republican Party, you know, when you're talking about Pennsylvania, there's a lot of rural areas in the state, and they make up probably a sizable part of the state Republican committee, who probably looks at the Philadelphia Republican committee and says they're too far left. One of their candidates for council was a former Democrat. David O was to the left of Sherrell Parker on certain issues. So if you're looking at it from an ideology standpoint, there may be a stark divide there, and maybe that's why they don't get help.
You kind of have to remember that Arlen Specter was a Republican in the Senate for a lot of years before he decided that, before he was being primaried by Pat Toomey for being too far left. And this is despite the fact that he was a fairly reliable Republican vote on most things.
Yeah. And if you were to try to make a caricature of a Philadelphia Republican, maybe Arlen Specter is a good model for what that could be, or what it was anyway.
I think the operable words there is what it was, and then
Mhm.
whether we like to think about it or not, I think the reality is on all of the political issues that have to do with identity politics, we are as a country much farther left than we were 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But as an economic politics, if we talk about economics and we talk about big business and we talk about insurance companies, we are farther right than we were 30 years ago. One of the things I think was amazing is to consider if Richard Nixon ran against President Obama in the presidential elections, Richard Nixon would have been on economic issues to President Obama's left.
Yes.
You know, wage and price freezes, detente with Russia, guaranteed minimum living check for every American, national health care plan through the government. All of those things, clean water, clean air, all of those things at one point were Republican issues where the Democrats were farther left. But as a country, while there are increasing rights and increasing protections based on identity politics, on economic politics, we are far poorer. Our middle class is far poorer. Our poor are far poorer, and our rich are far richer than we've seen in the last 50 years.
Lance, it's always interesting when you're speaking with people who are on the far left who will tell you Richard Nixon was the last liberal president we had, and it's always kind of a surprise to me to hear that. But for the reasons you laid out, it makes sense. There's truth to that. Marco, if you're advising the Philadelphia Republican Party today about what they need to do in the future, what are you telling them?
Well, the first question I would ask is what the heck happened with Martina White? Now, part of it is I've been out of the game for about 3 years. Not on my own, but due to the circumstances surrounding the pandemic. When Mayor Kenny won a re-election, I believe, right after that, Martina White, who is the lone Republican in the Philadelphia House delegation, representing the far Northeast, mid-30s, some tied to the Russian immigration, I think, or something or another, but she became party chair. And I interviewed her for my job at PLS, and one of the statements she made that stood out was that she was not going to acquiesce to patronage positions. Whether or not that sank her, I would think she's someone you'd want to have. It's interesting to look at the campaign. You saw there were two white people and a black person on the Democratic side. Republicans countered with Linwood Holland, a black man. Aaron Bashir running against Christy Brady for controller. He's South Asian. And then I believe the guy running against Sheriff Bilal was Caucasian. But there's diversity there. You need to have 66 ward leaders. You need to find a ward leader for every position. Then you really got to find a position where you can win a citywide race. Now, is 25% going to be enough to convince David O to potentially run against Larry Krasner in 2025? That is a seat you talk about on Inspector, former DA. That's something you need to have something to hang your hat on, some position where you can say, this is where it is beyond just city council, beyond just getting annihilated by mayors. At some point, you have to find something to re-energize the base. And yeah, it can't just be the national party, because you just don't have, if you can't tie it into everyday life, that's that. There's also, I don't know, I'm sure some people, fair or not, feel that they're just, constantly being harassed or constantly being bullied or constantly being, excommunicated and ostracized for espousing conservative beliefs. I don't live in the city, so I can't speak to that, but you need to, you probably need to get more money. You need to have more organization, and you need a more visible leader. I because I don't know what happened to Martina White, and I cover government to a degree. That's not great.
Okay.
And
So
Marco makes a really good point about money. If you don't have any money, you're not going to be able to play. And the only Republican fundraiser that I was sent any information about happened like 3 weeks before the general election.
Mm-hmm.
That's not going to do it.
Yeah. So we have about 10 minutes left here. What I'd like to do, we'll just go around the room. Something maybe we didn't talk about or something you'd like to make another point about that happened yesterday that is important or overlooked. Denise, let me start with you.
Tamika Lane, I think that we're not talking enough about the fact that for the second election cycle in a row, a Black woman is headed to one of Pennsylvania's appellate courts, which is important because prior to Tamika Lane and some of the other folks that have gotten into the court in recent years, there were no people of color in anywhere above municipal court or anywhere above Commonwealth court. So this is fairly significant, especially when you have things coming up like voting rights. Congress still has not acted on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. You have some states that are doing their own versions, like New Jersey stands out. They're trying to pass their own version of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, but no one seems to be in any hurry to make sure that all of the abuses that were covered by the 65 Voting Rights Act prior to the Supreme Court striking it down um, don't rear their ugly heads again. So I think it's really important that we pay attention to folks like Tamika Lane who are in the appellate courts and are going to be hearing these issues on voting rights, because in 2024, it's going to be a thing.
That's right. Lance, any other takeaways from last night?
I think there are two things I'd point out. One was what a tremendous job it was for the people who organized against the retention of 2 judges. Typically, the retention elections are nothing. Almost every judge wins 80-20 retained. It's a very difficult concept for most of us to understand, that we are voting not for a candidate, we're voting whether we want to keep a judge in office or remove it. The Working Families candidate, the bar, number of other groups had identified 2 judges that they said should not be retained. And in both cases, they were able to mount not a successful campaign, but a meaningful campaign. And they were able to get 40% of the people to vote against retention. And I think that shows that there is some interest in the judicial races. We were told there's never any interest, but I think there is some interest. And when the committee people decide to focus on it, when advocates decide to focus on it, it becomes one of those issues that is winnable. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but as time goes on, I think people will learn how to talk about that issue. The second point I would make is we didn't really talk about the controller's race. And with the Republicans losing their 2 seats in city council, and in my opinion, the Working Families Party being identified as Democrats, for example, as we were talking about who's going to run against Larry Krasner, I can almost guarantee you that the Working Families Party will not put up a candidate against Larry Krasner. Instead, they will endorse him and work for him as they did 2 years ago. But we don't really have, at this point, a check and balance on the Democratic mayor. We don't have an independent controller. She ran on the Democratic ticket, just like Mayor-elect Parker. We don't have independent voices in city council who will have the courage to attack the Democratic Party and call it out for its missteps. And I think that that's a loss. I think not having checks and balances on power is always a mistake. So those are the 2 things. Successful campaign to try and defeat the judges from being retained, and the loss of the check and balances.
Marco, anything else stand out from yesterday?
I would say generally, I was pleased to see that the ballot question passed, or I saw it was leading. It went through for creating a permanent office of disabilities for the city. I think that's a huge step to getting resources to people. having dealt with that on a personal basis, it can be very, very difficult, especially for a working person, to advocate for a loved one, especially older loved ones. And as the city's aging, you're going to have, more of that to deal with, not to speak of the unfortunately high number of people who are victims of gun violence, who, have probably quantifiable disabilities of all realms, from their trauma and from their physical damage. The other thing that stood out to me, I don't know if it's going to matter or not, but Rochelle Bilal won her race, but she won it at a lower clip than Brady and John Sabatina for the Register of Wills. I think she had like 72%, and Brady and Sabatina had 80%. And I know she had gone through the a close primary race as well. What's interesting is on the General Assembly side, the legislation has been concocted to give her office control over what is now the eviction responsibilities of the landlord's office. So if you're going to see, what's going to happen with that, city council is backing it, the House is backing it. Whether or not it goes to the Senate's a whole different story. But that would be something that would maybe give me some concern if I was looking at it from as granular perspective as possible.
Right. Rochelle Bilal won her race with 73% of the vote to her opponent's 26%. Meanwhile, Christy Brady had 80%, almost 81%, and John Sabatina had just over 82%. So a little bit behind her counterparts. Before we go, the one thing I will say is, I'm sorry. Somebody have something? Okay. The one thing I would say is something that didn't happen here in Philadelphia, or didn't even happen here in Pennsylvania. In Ohio, we saw Ohioans vote, I think it's 62%, to protect abortion in their state and abortion rights. And Ohio has become a red state over the last few elections. They have a Republican governor. They do have one Democratic senator, but they have been trending to the right. And pretty much anywhere we've seen this on the ballot, it has passed. And it's a very interesting situation happening. And I think it portends an unusual election season coming up in 2024. If you could call any of the last three elections usual, which I don't think you can. But I think we're in for another kind of wild ride in 2024. So that's where I am with that. Anybody?
Oh, don't forget, they also legalized weed in
Yes,
Ohio.
they did.
Right.
So now Pennsylvania is surrounded on all sides by states where you can get recreational weed.
Yes.
And just to follow up on Marco's point, I do wonder whether the Working Families Party is going to lead the fight to force the sheriff to give back the money that she's not giving back to homeowners who've lost their houses from sheriff's sale. There's so many patronage jobs in the sheriff's office, and there's so much money in contracts given out that really she's stealing from people, withholding money from people who have lost their homes at sheriff's sales, and nobody is calling her out on it. I mean, I know the Inquirer did the story, but there's not a single elected official who is saying we should remove this person from office. It's bad enough if you lose your house at sheriff's sale, but the money that you're supposed to get back that would allow you to start your life over, she's not refunding it. And somehow no one in city council, not the Working Families Party, not the Republicans, not the Democrats, has stood up and said, this is shameful.
Yeah. All right. We'll have to leave it there. Next week on the show, David
That
Mays
would be a thing that goes to the state level, though.
Okay. And we'll see. And Marco,
No. So I just.
And we'll see you
Thanks
next
again
week
for
on
having
Hall
me.
Monitor.
Thank you.